So I'm going to ask Clara and Antonella first to respond to the comments that Virginia made, and then we'll open things up to discussion from the audience.
May I start? Thank you for your comments, and apologies for being late and giving you the complete version of, but the substance was very similar. I mean, it wasn't different. You asked whether, why the fact that bilinguals, if they have superior inhibitory control, why they're not better? Are they not better? And I'm saying that might be precisely the problem. If we assume that there is a trade-off relationship, it's precisely their better inhibitory control that make them less able to integrate and update. And that might show up, particularly for the use of structures that require that rapid updating. Now, I don't want to mean that you don't have to do rapid updating when you process anything in language. Obviously, people are talking to you. You have to integrate and update what you're getting. But I think that certain kinds of integration rely on much more sort of automatic proceduralized abilities than the interpretation of pronouns, where, as I said, it has to be done, ex novo, so to speak, every single time. You can't rely on proceduralized abilities. On the other hand, I think you may have a point when you say that maybe early bilinguals, do it less. You see less of this phenomenon in early bilinguals because they've lived longer and they've had more experience of obviously of doing these kinds of operations. And so there is an element of proceduralization, to some extent. I said, pronouns, you can't talk about a fully proceduralized system that you apply in automatic, because you can't. So that's why I expect that individual differences in executive functions are more visible at that level.
Okay, so you asked me the question how all these executive functions are related and whether there is a more linear or hierarchical relationship and how they also relate to speed of processing. So I think because of the dynamic nature of executive functions, the answer will depend always on the context. So we see from different studies that different tasks with different complexities and in different contexts tap into different executive functions. And depending on, for example, there is this very simple study by Kipeda and Munakata who showed that speed of processing tasks differ. The more complex they become, the more executive functions are involved. Although we are claiming that they are all measuring speed of processing, as they looked at the increase in complexity, more and more executive functions were involved. So I think that that's exactly the nature of this, the dynamic nature of these executive functions, that you see different combinations, and depending on in which context and at which complexity level you look at, you will see different patterns. And that's why I try to focus on patterns, and that's why I'm trying always to compare to baseline, because I don't think there is a straightforward answer to this. It will depend on the context. We see that speed of processing seems to be more important in some executive functions or more closely related to some than others. In our young adult study, where we matched monolingual and bilingual young adults on speed of processing, we saw that, for example, in monitoring, there was no difference once we matched them. There was a very big difference before we matched them on speed of processing, because some of the bilinguals were much faster than the monolinguals. That's why we started matching them. But once we matched them, there was no difference. However, for example, in proactive interference, we saw, even when we matched them in speed of processing, there was a large effect in proactive interference, even in reaction time. So there is something beyond that overall speed of processing there. So it seems that even this speed is not linearly related. Depending on different executive functions and contexts, it may play a different role. We also looked at some variables, and you showed, for example, SES. In the Hungarian study, and that wasn't the bilingual, in the monolingual children, we had very low SES children. And when we looked at their executive function performance on these tasks, interestingly, although in the language test they performed like typically developing kids, except for vocabulary, which we expect based on SES, in the executive function test, they perform more like language-impaired children, very poorly. So these all show a very dynamic relationship. And in, for example, young adults with dyslexia, going back to general cognitive functions, we saw that, for example, the Raven, because that's what you use, the Raven IQ in those individuals was highly predicted by some executive functions, but not by others. And the ones that predicted best was proactive interference. So,
can I just briefly answer another one of your points? You mentioned, the incomplete mastery shouldn't be underestimated. I completely agree. And certainly it may be a factor for children. For adults, although you can never rule it out, but in our studies, we recruited very advanced non-native speakers. So people, who can perhaps be said to have gone all the way, maybe not phonologically, but certainly in their mastery of, morphosyntax, vocabulary. These people sometimes pass for native speakers. And so we specialize, in fact, on these, extremely able people, and, we want to understand, well, on the assumption that they have a brain like everybody else, what makes it possible for these people to reach these very high levels of competence. And so, incomplete acquisition, certainly, they've had plenty of exposure, plenty of use. I mean, these are structures, they're not remote, arcane structures. I mean, if you use the language, you have to use them all the time.
Yeah, I just think when you're dealing with something that's that complex, and it is complex because the mapping is not straightforward, it'd be interesting to see it compared with other complex syntax performance, just to ferret that out.
We did, yes. In our studies of pronouns, we tested these people on their performance on syntactic structures that correlate with Italian, with having, knowledge of Italian or the grammar of Italian. And there we don't find a difference. At that level, they're absolutely native-like.
I have a couple of questions. While I'm forming my questions, people who would like to ask questions should feel free to go to the microphones. So I have two strategy-type questions of all of you, really. One of them connects with yesterday's talk by Naomi Friedman, where the strategy, and Naomi, if you're here and I get it wrong, feel free to correct me, where her strategy is to find tasks that, as much as possible, load onto a single executive function plus the common factor, or just the common factor. So I'm wondering what you think as a strategy of our, in fact, trying to find tasks that load on a single factor before we look at tasks that we know involve contributions from many executive functions, so that we can see what's happening on those tasks that are more unitary, and then how can we generalize from that. And my second question about strategy has to do with making use of different populations. So Clara mentioned, as did Antonella, that different groups not having anything to do with the bilingual, non-bilingual distinction may also vary in how they perform on some of these tasks. And we could use those groups potentially as comparison groups to try to get a little more handle on the situation. Or also, as Antonella did, to look at very different kinds of bilinguals as a way of trying to understand better what's going on. So I don't think we can ever manipulate a whole bunch of variables at once and come up with an answer, but these are ways that we might be able to manipulate some variables in a more constrained way that might get us somewhere. So any of your thoughts about that?
Yes, thank you. In terms of whether we can find executive functions that really just measure particular components, we know that even the simple tasks involve several functions simultaneously, because there is always, when there is memory, there is always attention. There's just no way of separating these into single tasks. However, I think one way, and the way that we are trying to follow, is that if we use stepwise experimental manipulations, then from the differences across different manipulations and conditions, we can conclude something, that because we know that here we increased memory load versus here we increased interference, and here we increased sustained attention. And if we compare across these conditions and we try to keep everything experimentally controlled, then we can see some variations. I think every natural task involves several of these components, and what Naomi showed, that was a statistical analysis, the result of a statistical analysis. So that's different than looking at specifically experimentally these functions. I don't think we can really separate them completely, but I really think that following certain experimental manipulations is a good way to look at some of these relationships, at least.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. I think one of the things that it's come out very clearly up to now in this conference is that there's perhaps a need to use different kinds of tasks and examine the convergence among these different measures rather than building everything on a particular task. Now, in Edinburgh, we've been using the subtests of the test of the TA, the test of everyday attention, that load on particular subcomponents of executive function. But arguably, we should supplement. Now we have a huge database. We've used that test with many hundreds of bilinguals, so we have some idea of variation. But I think we should really supplement that, look at a variety of measures and examine the convergence, because it's very difficult to identify precisely the subcomponent that you're interested in, and that's why the kind of account that I presented is methodologically fraught with difficulties, because it makes it harder to really look. If there is a trade-off, you need precise measures of what it is that enters the trade-off relationship. So I acknowledge this, and I can only learn how to do this best.
Can I just add, with regard to your second question about different populations, I think it's critical to answer these questions. I think both of these talks have been exemplary in trying to look at how the different population affects performance and what are the factors related to that affect performance. But also, I think we had a good model this morning with Albert Costa using disordered populations where you can identify some disorder and see if you can find dissociation between performance on different factors.
Yes. Hello, Elinor Saeed Haddad from Bar-Ilan University. First of all, thank you for very interesting talks. As a linguist, I felt very much at home during Sorachi's talk, but in fact, my question is for Clara. One of your findings was that in addition to bilingualism, language use predicted differences in the bilingual advantage. And my question is, to what extent do you think this might be an artifact of the way bilingualism as a continuous variable was tested? Or are you really implying that there is the oral language component in the bilingual experience that might have some independent contribution to the equation and which has to be taken into account? The reason why I really I'm interested in that is related to my previous question, which I didn't get an answer for, and that's what do we expect to happen in a diglossic context like Arabic, in which the children do not, this is not a bilingual context, however, the children do engage in two varieties of the same language, but where there is asymmetry in how much oral language use is involved. So oral language is basically in the spoken language, but the standard language is the language of basically literacy and reading, basically. Indeed, there is a lot of, all the writing happens in the standard language. Of course, now there is electronic media, and there is a lot of also writing in the spoken, but there is asymmetry in how much oral language use there is in the two varieties. And I was wondering whether in this context we expect different things to happen with respect to the bilingual advantage. I just have to say that when we talk about Arabic, we don't talk about a bilingual context, of course, but we do talk about two varieties of the same language, which are quite distinct from each other. They are related, but quite distinct. So in one of my studies, I show that a 5-year-old who speaks spoken Arabic, only 20% of the words that he speaks will be words that will retain their form in the standard language. And that's why if you read a story to him at the age of 5, he's not going to understand basically what the story is all about.
Okay, so I'm trying to answer in two different ways. One, based on our data, unfortunately, it's a very small sample, so I don't want really to draw like big conclusions because we need to test this further. It was quite surprising that very highly proficient children, some of them really use the weaker or one of their languages, not the dominant language, 10% of the time. So I was very surprised because I thought that these proficient children, because of the context where they live here in New York or in Romania, they use both languages pretty frequently. And it's interesting to see that there seems to be like a weaker correlation there between language proficiency and this language use in those children because they don't use it and still are very highly proficient. So that's an interesting question, why and how. Now, some of these children, for some of the children, English was first language. For some of the children, English was second language, but was still dominant. So, for example, the Russian and the Spanish-speaking children in New York, their album was Russian or Spanish. But now they are in a school system. They are 8, 10 years old. They've been in the school system for 5, 6, 7 years. And so English is their dominant language, even though the other language was L1. So I think we need much more data to look at it. I'm pretty sure there is a relationship, and I'm also pretty sure, based on what we are seeing, that it's not one-on-one. So there is a more complex relationship. When you talked about the Arabic data, I was just thinking that one of the first benefits of being bilingual in the child language literature, especially in the early literature, was always that these children are more flexible because from early on they learn that, let's say, one object has different labels. And so they are not so referential than, let's say, the monolingual children whose mothers are, what is this, what is this, what is this? These children learn right from the beginning that there is no answer straightforward. What is this? Because it depends on which language I'm using, right? So if you think about your bidialectal children, I think flexibility, whatever that means, must be very similar to these early bilingual children. But I really don't know much about it.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk. I have a question to Dr. Sorace. Oh, my name is Mihi from National University of Singapore. I was very interested in your the experimental results on the university language student. They perform better in the task compared to the other student without any language experiences. So I was just wondering if you look at any language learning mode, like formality, if it's a formal setting of language learning for your previous studies, like Italian, English, Spanish, English, those students, they have any experience in any formal learning of those languages. And because it's formal setting of language learning experience could enhance your metalinguistic awareness. And from my background, I'm doing L3 acquisition, and this formal language learning of the second language could actually help you to get better performance in the third language, and that can be inferred to, they can infer that they have better maybe executive function. So I'm just wondering if you have any interpretation of those formal setting of language learning experiences of your university language student, and also in addition that if the university language student is referring to the student who are studying linguistics, like having maybe metalinguistic awareness, metalinguistic knowledge, to maybe refer back to their first and second language to understand their language better. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting point. The short answer is no, we didn't, in all the studies we did, we studied late bilinguals who were highly proficient in both languages, who used both languages in their everyday life, which is not what typically happens to, low education level immigrants who, may actually discontinue the use of their native language in many cases. So these were all, highly educated and so on. So we don't have a point of comparison with these groups that you're talking about. If you're referring to the study on university students that I mentioned before, this was a study of university students who study for a language degree. And in the Scottish system, this is a 4-year degree, and the 3rd year has to be spent abroad in the country where the language is spoken. So we tested 1st-year students and 4th-year students. So the 4th-year students had just come back from this experience abroad, so they were highly fluent. And we compared them with students graduating, majoring in other non-language related degrees, so literature, for example. We tested them on a variety of cognitive functions and verbal fluency tasks. And as we expected, for verbal fluency, we found that the 4th-year university students are worse. So there is a decrease in verbal fluency associated with increased bilingualism and command of the second language. But for some aspects of executive function, there is a steeper. Everybody improves, so that's good news, for university studies in general. But the language students improve. The improvement is steeper than for the literature students.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I just have a quick question regarding
Say who you are first.
Oh, hi. My name is Zoltan. I'm actually here at the conference, and I have a quick question regarding. Thanks. And I have a quick question regarding executive functioning and individuals with right hemisphere brain injuries, specific to writing. Have you looked at that population and how right hemisphere brain injuries impact their writing and organizational abilities, specifically bilingual individuals?
I haven't, so I haven't either. Sorry. Maybe somebody else in the audience is able to answer?
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Say who you are.
Yes, I'm Robert Remez from Colombia, and my question is, while not entirely innocent, it's not barbed. Antonella, when you were talking about the proficiency, the L2 proficiency of your subject, you mentioned that they're superb in every way except many of them are not competent phonologically. And I think what you probably meant was phonologically and phonetically. So I would like to propose a terminological distinction here, that anyone who's proficient bilingually, except phonologically in one of the languages, be referred to as incompletely bilingual. And that will be something that will engage those of us who understand that phonology is the best part. I'm sort of serious. But what I want to know is, suppose you broke out that group separately who were proficient in all aspects of language, including phonology and phonetics in their L2. Where would they fall in the performance range?
Okay, there are two. Okay, I'm not primarily interested in phonetics and phonology. I'm a syntactician.
I knew that. You know. I could tell that.
So we have a conflict of interest.
Some of us are. And
I know.
We want to press forward with this problem.
The thing is that, as you probably know, it's very, very difficult to find late bilinguals who are completely native-like phonetically and phonologically. So it's extremely difficult. I mean, these people exist. You know, no doubt about it. But unless we want to, you know, do a series of individual case studies, you know, those people are very, very difficult to find. Now, that creates problems, you know, for deciding, you know, when you screen people, you know, participants, how good are they? You give them proficiency tests, you know. In our case, you know, we had a series of judges, you know, who gave impressionistic judgments apart from the objective proficiency test, you know. We asked people, you know, well, do you think these people is native-like, or how native is it? And we mixed, you know, their speech with speech from native speakers, so they didn't know who they were listening to. Clearly, foreign accent is the first thing that is heard, right? I mean, it's very salient, and that tends to bias judgments about other aspects of proficiency. So it's a serious methodological problem that I don't have a perfect solution for. Yes.
Well, so I think someone will work this out. I know of it. I know of one individual of whom you speak who would have been perfect for a case study. They say that Roman Jakobson spoke 100 languages, each of them Russian. If only we could have gotten the measures.
Okay.
Hi, Enrica Picando, University of Toronto. I'm very happy to have been here 2 days because I saw a movement. I'm in education, I'm not in psychology or linguistics. But I can say, and I work on bilingualism, but more on plurilingualism. I'm very happy that I have seen a kind of pattern towards openness, starting yesterday with Jennifer's presentation, when at the end she asked, we should have asked the frequency and use of both languages, and not only the age of acquisition, but also the when and the how the language was acquired. And today we went 2 steps further with the discussant of the first group, saying that we really need to keep into consideration many aspects, and he mentioned some. And I think we went another step further now with this panel, especially when you talked about reciprocal influence and bridges that we should probably construct. I was a bit surprised to hear this last question when we talked about a perfect bilingual. Is there anything as a perfect bilingual, or is there anything as a perfect monolingual? And I think that this is one of the main points, because in the entire conference, I haven't heard much, at least, maybe correct me if I misunderstood or I was absent-minded for a while, but I haven't heard any real definition of what a bilingual is and the criteria upon which this definition is constructed, and also how this proficiency, which is a bit the elephant in the room, has been defined and measured before going into the studies. But I would add just a couple of things from our domain, like the way you have been taught the language plays a huge role, but also the representation of the language, I mean the social representation. What kind of immigrant are you? What is your relationship with that language? Do you like that language, or do you leave that language as the language of the oppressor? And so you're resistant towards that language. Were you allowed to code switch both at home and in your education, or was it seen as a kind of contamination of, unfortunately, the still existing pure vision of the native speaker as the personification of all the virtues? So it's just, it's not a real question, but it's just a hope. As somebody has said in a previous question, I moved from depression to hope. I did the same, and I'm hoping to see this kind of bridges that you mentioned, taking into account all these aspects because in education, we look a lot at your research, and it's a kind of important thing for us to know if we are going on the right track, in the right direction or not. Because then, yes, this is an influence on policymakers and educators and so on and so forth. So it's for us particularly important to have this kind of multiple indications and not just a yes or no question or answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Can I just answer? I'll answer as a researcher first, and then as a person who does, as I said, a lot of public engagement, and I talk to real people, non-academics all the time, in all kinds of sectors. So I hear what their questions are and what their understanding of bilingualism is and what their misconceptions are all the time. So, but as a researcher, I think you're absolutely right that, we need to take into account, all the factors, the variables that you mentioned. We try to measure these, obviously, how can you measure these variables? You try to collect as much information as you can through, background questionnaires. If you work with children, obviously you have to get this information from the parents. We developed very sort of complex and detailed questionnaires for parents that give us an idea not just about the quantity of exposure that the child had to languages, but also the quality of exposure, so what did they do? How many speakers speak this language to the children? Do they hear it only at school? Do they hear it only at home? Do they switch all the time, or do they live in a diglossic environment? All these factors are very important, and we certainly need to get enough information about them. Then we need to understand how they interact, with the research questions that we're addressing, right? The second question, the perfect bilingual, yes, bilinguals are not the sum of two monolinguals. And I think, there is really a direction of research that is trying to explore that very actively now. So maybe really we should try to see bilingualism in terms of engaging or requiring some kind of reconfiguration. Well, in the case of a child who grows up with two languages, their brain or, their general cognitive systems won't be identical to a child who grows up only with one language, right? And we're talking about broad effects here, beyond the terms advantage or disadvantage, which, as I said, makes sense only if you keep this monolingual comparison in mind. So as a public engagement person, when people ask me, how many hours, typically, how many hours is enough to become bilingual? It's impossible to answer that question, right? Because it depends what people do in those hours. It's not just, 4 hours a week guaranteed that your child will become bilingual. It's absurd, right? But people start from those misconceptions, so it's up to us to, to give them enough information so that they can have realistic expectations. Now, I say a bilingual is not someone who's perfect in both languages, but it's someone who knows and uses both languages on a regular basis. There's always a language that may be a lot ahead from compared to the other, or just slightly ahead, depending on the circumstances, and the relative balance between the two languages can and does change.
I just want to follow up, and I think all these variables you mentioned, and these are very valid concerns, and it sounded like a summary of the conference almost. I just want to say something about proficiency, that I completely agree. We don't have sensitive proficiency measures. We are using all kinds of proficiency measures. There are 2 doctoral students right now in our program who have used different proficiency measures. One was Eve Higby, who I think, if I'm correct, she compared 6 different measures of language proficiency, the same individuals, and she didn't find correlation across all of them. So, and Jang Mi-yoon is just writing her dissertation where she looked at a little bit more objectively proficiency by using a synonym naming task. And also from the same participants, these were young adults, she asked how they rate their own proficiency, and there's no correlation between the two. So they perform differently when we measure them than what they are saying, how they think their proficiency is. So actually that would be very important to have somewhat more objective measures, particularly in children where we are relying on parents. And for example, in the Romanian study, the parents said 3 different things, and we know that all these children were very, very similar in Romanian because they had to use it every day.
Okay, on that happy note, we will have a coffee break until 3:50. Let's thank our speakers.
She was so supportive. Yeah, thank you so much.
Despite the fact that she got incomplete slides. Oh, it's not what she means. Sorry.
Thank you.
No, but it was good. I think I will.
Is this charger? No, I can show you.
I have one in my office if you need it.
But the point is, what the news is
So if that doesn't work, I can go up.
And that
that's wonderful.
will